What if I told you the world has already begun moving away from the American dollar, and you didn't even notice? Not with headlines, not with dramatic announcements, but quietly, transaction by transaction, payment by payment. While you were watching the news, checking your bank account, living your life, the very foundation of global finance has been quietly shifting beneath your feet. And if you think this doesn't affect you, think again. Because when the world's reserve currency loses its grip, everything changes. Your savings, your investments, the price of gas at the pump, the stability of your retirement, all of it. This isn't speculation. This isn't fear-mongering. This is happening right now. And in this video, I'm going to show you exactly why nations are quietly abandoning the dollar, what they're building instead, and why this shift will redefine your financial reality, whether you like it or not. Here's the mechanism. The dollar stays dominant because global trade must touch dollar rails, pricing, clearing, reserves. The moment countries build reliable ways around those rails, the dollar doesn't collapse, it becomes optional. And optional is the beginning of the end. This is the part most people misunderstand. Let me show you the trigger. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, and Western nations froze $300 billion of Russian reserves held in American and European banks, something fundamental shifted in the minds of every nation watching. It wasn't just about Russia. It was about the message sent to every country on Earth. Your money isn't really yours if it's held in Western institutions. Your financial sovereignty isn't guaranteed. And that realization, that brutal, uncomfortable realization, has triggered the quietest but most significant financial realignment in 70 years. This isn't about politics. It's about survival. So what changes first? Prices, rates, or your job market? Now here's what almost nobody is talking about. The shift away from the dollar isn't happening through dramatic declarations or coordinated attacks on American power. It's happening through thousands of small, rational decisions made by banks, corporations, and governments around the world, each one choosing alternatives because those alternatives now make more sense. A Saudi oil company accepting yuan instead of dollars for a shipment to China. A Brazilian farmer selling soybeans to Russia and receiving rubles instead of greenbacks. An Indian manufacturer importing machinery from Germany and settling the bill in euros rather than going through the dollar clearing system. Each transaction seems insignificant alone, but together they represent a fundamental rewiring of global commerce, a quiet vote of no confidence in the dollar system that built American prosperity for generations. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This shift isn't happening because other nations suddenly became more powerful. It's happening because America made the dollar weapon. And weapons eventually get replaced by tools that don't point back at you. Let me show you exactly what I mean. In 2000, over 70% of global trade was invoiced in US dollars. Today, that number has fallen to under 60%. That might not sound dramatic, but in the architecture of global finance, that 10 percentage point shift represents trillions of dollars in transactions that no longer flow through American financial pipes. This is where it stops being geopolitics and becomes your monthly budget. When fewer transactions touch dollar rails, global demand for dollars softens. That pushes America's borrowing costs up, and those costs come back to you through rates, taxes, and prices. Think about what that means. Every dollar that doesn't pass through New York is a dollar that doesn't generate fees for American banks. Every transaction that bypasses SWIFT is a transaction that can't be monitored, sanctioned, or frozen by American authorities. Every trade settled in yuan, euros, or local currencies is a tiny brick removed from the foundation of dollar dominance. And while you were distracted by inflation numbers and interest rate announcements, this quiet demolition has been accelerating. Not collapsing, accelerating. Because nations aren't stupid. They see what happened to Russia. They see what could happen to them. And they're building alternatives, not out of malice, but out of self-preservation. And if you're wondering why this matters to you personally, let me be perfectly clear. When the dollar loses its privileged position, the cost of maintaining that position falls on you, the American consumer, the American taxpayer, the person watching this video right now. And if you miss this next part, the whole story sounds like hype. But before I show you the 3 structural shifts that are quietly dismantling dollar hegemony, I need you to understand something fundamental about how power works in the modern world. Power doesn't disappear through dramatic collapse. It evaporates through 1,000 small leaks. Think of the dollar system like a dam holding back an ocean of global capital. For 70 years, that dam has been maintained, reinforced, expanded. It created unprecedented prosperity. It lifted billions from poverty. It prevented great power wars. But dams develop cracks. Small ones at first. A hairline fracture here, a tiny leak there. For years, nobody notices. The water still flows. The system still works. But slowly, imperceptibly, pressure builds behind those cracks. And one day, usually when you least expect it, the dam doesn't explode. It just stops holding back the ocean. The water finds another path, and the landscape downstream is forever changed. That's what's happening to the dollar right now. Not explosion, redirection. And redirection is far more dangerous than collapse because it happens without warning, without drama, without the headlines that would make you pay attention. In 30 seconds, you'll see the exact chain reaction. So let me show you the first crack in the dam, the payment infrastructure shift that's quietly rerouting trillions away from American control. For 70 years after World War II, global payments ran through a single set of rails. SWIFT for messaging, correspondent banking through New York and London, dollar clearing that gave America extraordinary leverage over global finance. This system wasn't an accident. It was designed. At Bretton Woods in 1944, American negotiators, led by Harry Dexter White, crafted a monetary architecture that would cement dollar dominance for generations. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. Oil was priced in dollars. International trade flowed through American banks. And America gained a unique privilege, the ability to borrow in its own currency, while the rest of the world had to earn dollars before they could spend them. This exorbitant privilege, as French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called it, allowed America to run persistent trade deficits, finance endless wars, and maintain living standards far beyond what its production alone could support. For decades, this arrangement worked brilliantly for America. But like all privileges, it came with a hidden cost. The cost of dependency, the cost of resentment, the cost of creating a system so centralized that its failure would bring down everything connected to it. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. America didn't lose the dollar's dominance through weakness. America is actively pushing nations away from the dollar through its own actions. Think about the sanctions regime. Since 9/11, America has dramatically expanded its use of financial sanctions as a foreign policy tool. First against terrorists, then against rogue states, then against entire economies. Each time, the message was clear: comply with American demands or lose access to the global financial system. And for years, this worked. Nations feared exclusion from dollar markets more than they feared American military power. But fear has a breaking point. When you push someone into a corner, they don't surrender. They find another way out. And that's exactly what's happening now. Nations aren't abandoning the dollar because they hate America. They're abandoning it because they refuse to be held hostage by a system they can't control. When Russia was cut off from SWIFT and had $300 billion frozen, Every finance minister on earth asked the same question. Could that happen to us? And the answer was yes. It could. It can. And that realization has triggered the quietest financial revolution in modern history. Let me show you exactly how this revolution is unfolding. After the 2014 Crimea sanctions, Russia began building SPFS, its own alternative to SWIFT, not to replace the global system, but to ensure survival if cut off. China accelerated its cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS, processing settlements in yuan rather than dollars. The United Arab Emirates and India launched a local currency trade mechanism. Brazil and Argentina discussed a common currency for regional trade. None of these systems threaten dollar dominance today, but together they create optionality, the ability to keep trading when Western rails close. And optionality changes everything. When nations know they have an exit ramp, they negotiate differently. They take different risks. They align with different partners. The shift isn't in headlines, it's in the quiet diversification happening right now in corporate treasuries worldwide. A German manufacturer selling machinery to Brazil might still invoice in dollars, but that same manufacturer selling to Vietnam might accept yuan through CIPS to avoid dollar conversion fees and US oversight. A Saudi oil company might still price most barrels in dollars, but when selling to China, it increasingly accepts yuan directly, settled through Shanghai's oil futures market. These decisions seem minor individually. Cumulatively, they reroute the flow of global commerce away from Western choke points. One estimate suggests over 20% of global trade now settles in currencies other than the dollar, up from just 10% 15 years ago. Not a revolution, an evolution. But evolution compounds. And here's what most people miss. This shift isn't about replacing the dollar. It's about making the dollar optional. And optionality is the first step toward irrelevance. But this is just the first crack in the dam. The second crack is far more dangerous and far less visible. It's happening in the energy markets that have anchored dollar dominance for 50 years. Since the 1970s, oil has been priced in dollars. This petrodollar system ensured constant global demand for greenbacks. Every nation needed dollars to buy oil, which meant every nation held dollar reserves, which meant America could borrow cheaply and spend lavishly. It was a brilliant arrangement. But brilliant arrangements don't last forever. They last until someone finds a better deal. And that's exactly what's happening now. In 2023, China and Brazil agreed to trade oil in local currencies. Russia began accepting yuan, rupees, and dirhams for its oil exports. Saudi Arabia, the guardian of the petrodollar system for decades, began discussing yuan-denominated oil futures with Beijing. These moves aren't symbolic, they're structural. Every barrel of oil traded outside the dollar system is another brick removed from the foundation of American financial power. And while Western media focuses on production quotas and OPEC meetings, the real story is unfolding in backroom negotiations, where energy producers are quietly diversifying away from dollar dependency. Why? Because they've learned the same lesson everyone else has learned. Never depend on a system you don't control. When your national wealth depends on a currency issued by a foreign government that might freeze your assets or cut you off from global markets, you have no real sovereignty. You have the illusion of sovereignty. And illusions shatter when reality intrudes. The dollar doesn't have to fall for you to feel it. Now let me show you something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about global finance. The third crack in the dam isn't in payments or energy. It's in data. In the digital infrastructure that controls the flow of information, capital, and power in the 21st century. Data has replaced oil as the world's most valuable resource. And nations are realizing that whoever controls data flows controls the future of artificial intelligence, finance, and national security. Europe passed GDPR not just for privacy, but to assert sovereignty over citizen data flowing to American tech giants. China built the Great Firewall and required data localization, not merely for censorship, but to ensure its AI development isn't dependent on foreign servers. India now mandates payment data stay within borders. Brazil requires health records stored locally. Indonesia demands social media companies maintain domestic servers. This isn't just regulation, it's sovereignty reassertion in the digital age. When data can't freely cross borders, innovation clusters form around regulatory zones. Capital follows those clusters, talent follows capital. And slowly, without treaties or declarations, the world fragments into competing spheres of technological influence, each with its own rules, its own standards, its own version of the future. Chinese AI trains on Chinese data under Chinese rules. European AI develops under GDPR constraints. American AI evolves within US legal frameworks. These systems will increasingly diverge, not just in capabilities, but in values embedded in their design. And that divergence shapes everything from medical diagnostics to loan approvals to criminal justice algorithms. The power to define these systems becomes the power to shape society itself. And America is losing that power, not through military defeat, but through regulatory overreach and technological arrogance. But before I dive deeper into these three structural shifts, I need you to understand something fundamental about why this is happening now. Why, after 70 years of dollar dominance, are nations suddenly building alternatives? The answer isn't in geopolitics. It's in arithmetic. Simple, brutal arithmetic. America's national debt has surpassed $34 trillion. Interest payments alone now exceed defense spending. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has swollen to nearly $9 trillion. These aren't abstract numbers, they're signals. Signals that tell the world America can no longer maintain the fiscal discipline required to anchor the global monetary system. When your own central bank becomes your largest creditor, when you're borrowing from yourself to pay your bills, the world notices. And the world responds by diversifying away from your currency. Not because they want to, because they have to. Because no rational actor puts all their eggs in a basket that's developing cracks. This isn't about America being weak. It's about America making choices that undermine the very foundations of dollar confidence. Choices like weaponizing the financial system through endless sanctions. Choices like running perpetual deficits without consequence. Choices like allowing political dysfunction to threaten the full faith and credit of the United States every few years during debt ceiling standoffs. Each choice seems rational in the moment. Cumulatively, they destroy trust. And trust is the only thing holding the dollar system together. Let me show you exactly how this arithmetic is playing out in real time. When the Federal Reserve creates trillions of dollars to buy government debt, as it did during the pandemic and continues to do today, it's not just stimulating the economy, it's diluting the value of every dollar held by foreign creditors. China holds over $800 billion in US treasuries. Japan holds over $1 trillion. Every time the Fed prints money to buy bonds, those holdings lose purchasing power. Not dramatically, not immediately, but steadily, relentlessly, like water dripping on stone. And foreign holders aren't stupid. They see this happening. They feel the erosion of their wealth, and they respond by slowly, quietly reducing their exposure. Not dumping, that would crash the market and destroy their own holdings, but diversifying, shifting a percentage here, reducing purchases there, building alternatives everywhere. This isn't conspiracy, it's self-preservation. And self-preservation is the most powerful force in global finance. Stronger than ideology, stronger than alliance, stronger than history. When your wealth is at stake, you protect it. Period. And that's exactly what the world is doing right now. Protecting itself from a dollar system that can no longer guarantee the value of the assets it issues. But here's where things get really uncomfortable. The shift away from the dollar isn't just happening because other nations are building alternatives. It's happening because America is actively encouraging it through its own policies. Think about the Inflation Reduction Act. On the surface, it's about climate change and clean energy. But buried in its provisions are massive subsidies for American manufacturing, subsidies that explicitly discriminate against foreign companies. The message to allies like Europe and Canada: come to America and build your factories here, or lose access to the American market. This isn't free trade. This is economic nationalism disguised as environmental policy. And economic nationalism destroys the very cooperation that sustains global monetary systems. When America puts America first above global stability, it shouldn't be surprised when other nations put their own interests first too. When America weaponizes the dollar through sanctions, it shouldn't be surprised when other nations seek alternatives. When America runs trillion-dollar deficits without consequence, it shouldn't be surprised when creditors lose confidence. Cause and effect, action and reaction. This isn't complicated, it's basic human nature. And basic human nature is driving the quietest financial revolution in modern history. Here's the good news. This isn't collapse, it's transition. Now let me show you the evidence that this revolution is already underway. Look at the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In 2023, they announced plans to create a common currency for trade among member nations, not to replace the dollar globally, but to reduce dependence on it regionally. This matters because BRICS represents over 40% of the world's population and nearly 30% of global GDP. When nations controlling that much economic activity begin building payment alternatives, it's not a protest, it's a pivot. A strategic pivot away from dollar dependency toward regional self-sufficiency. And BRICS is just the beginning. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Iran, and others, is developing its own payment infrastructure. The Eurasian Economic Union is working on a common financial framework. Even traditional American allies are getting in on the action. The European Union has been quietly developing INSTEX, a payment mechanism designed to bypass US sanctions on Iran. Not because Europe supports Iran's regime, but because Europe refuses to be caught in the crossfire of American financial warfare. When your ally builds systems to circumvent your sanctions, you have a problem. Not a geopolitical problem, a credibility problem. And credibility is the currency of global finance. Lose it, and you lose everything. But let me be perfectly clear about something. This shift away from the dollar isn't happening because America is collapsing. America isn't collapsing. Its economy is still the largest in the world. Its military is still the most powerful. Its innovation capacity is still unmatched. This shift is happening because the world is evolving. Because multipolarity is replacing unipolarity. Because nations that once had no choice but to accept dollar dominance now have alternatives. And alternatives change everything. When you have only one option, you accept it, even if it's flawed. When you have multiple options, you choose the one that serves your interests best. That's not disloyalty, that's rationality. And the world is becoming increasingly rational about its financial relationships with America. Not out of hatred, out of self-interest. And self-interest is the most powerful force in international relations. Stronger than ideology. Stronger than history, stronger than alliance. When your national interests are at stake, you protect them. Period. And that's exactly what the world is doing right now, protecting its interests from a financial system that increasingly serves American interests at the expense of everyone else. Let me show you exactly how this protection is playing out in the real world. Take the case of Saudi Arabia. For 50 years, Saudi Arabia was the linchpin of the petrodollar system. In the 1970s, the kingdom agreed to price all its oil in dollars in exchange for American military protection and security guarantees. This deal anchored global dollar demand for generations. But in 2023, Saudi Arabia began discussing yuan-denominated oil futures with China, not abandoning the dollar, but diversifying away from it. Why? Because Saudi Arabia's interests have changed. China is now Saudi Arabia's largest trading partner. American security guarantees feel less reliable than they once did, and the kingdom is pursuing Vision 2030, a plan to reduce dependence on oil and diversify its economy. Part of that diversification includes reducing dependence on the dollar, not because Saudi Arabia hates America, but because Saudi Arabia is pursuing its own national interests, and those interests no longer align perfectly with American interests. This isn't betrayal, it's evolution. And evolution is happening everywhere you look. Russia accepting multiple currencies for its oil, Brazil trading with China in local currencies, India building payment links with the UAE. Each move seems small alone. Together, they represent a fundamental rewiring of global commerce, a quiet vote of no confidence in the dollar system that built American prosperity for generations. But here's what almost nobody is talking about. The shift away from the dollar isn't just an economic phenomenon, it's a psychological phenomenon. It's about confidence, about trust, about the belief that tomorrow will look like today. For 70 years, the world trusted the dollar. It trusted American institutions. It trusted that the United States would maintain the fiscal discipline and political stability required to anchor the global monetary system. That trust wasn't blind. It was earned through decades of responsible stewardship, through predictable policy, through respect for the rule of law. But trust can be lost faster than it's earned, and America has been losing trust for years. Through political dysfunction that threatens default every few years, through sanctions that weaponize the financial system against allies and adversaries alike, through deficits that show no sign of abating, through a central bank that has become the largest holder of government debt. Each action erodes trust, not dramatically, not immediately, but steadily, relentlessly, like water dripping on stone. And when trust erodes, alternatives emerge, not because they're better, but because they're different, because they offer optionality, because they provide an escape route when the main path becomes unreliable. This isn't about America being weak. It's about America making choices that undermine the very trust required to maintain dollar dominance. Choices that prioritize short-term political gain over long-term financial stability. Choices that sacrifice global confidence for domestic convenience. And the bill for those choices is coming due. Not in collapse, but in quiet, relentless diversification away from dollar dependency. Let me show you exactly how this loss of trust is manifesting in real time. Look at central bank reserve holdings. For decades, central banks around the world held the majority of their reserves in dollars, typically 60 to 70%. This wasn't an accident. It reflected deep confidence in American institutions, the rule of law, and the stability of the US financial system. But over the past 15 years, that percentage has been steadily declining. Today, dollar holdings represent closer to 55% of global reserves. That might not sound dramatic, but in the world of central banking, a 15 percentage point shift represents trillions of dollars being reallocated into euros, yen, yuan, gold, and other assets. Trillions. Think about what that means. Every dollar moved out of reserves is a vote of no confidence in the American financial system. Every euro or yuan added to reserves is a bet on alternatives to dollar dominance. And this trend is accelerating, not because central banks are dumping dollars, but because they're diversifying, reducing exposure, building hedges against a future where the dollar may no longer provide the safety and stability it once did. This isn't panic, it's prudence. And prudence is the most rational response to a system showing signs of strain. But here's where things get really uncomfortable. The shift away from the dollar isn't just happening because other nations are losing confidence in America. It's happening because America is losing confidence in itself. Think about the political dysfunction in Washington, the debt ceiling standoffs that threaten default every few years, the partisan gridlock that prevents meaningful fiscal reform, the short-term thinking that prioritizes the next election over the next generation. When the world sees this dysfunction, it doesn't see a nation capable of anchoring the global monetary system for another 70 years. It sees a nation struggling to govern itself. And nations that can't govern themselves can't be trusted to manage the world's money. This isn't about politics, it's about perception. And perception is reality in global finance. When other nations perceive American institutions as unstable, unreliable, or unpredictable, they respond by reducing their exposure to American assets. Not because they want to, because they have to. Because their citizens expect them to protect national wealth. And protecting national wealth means diversifying away from systems that show signs of instability. This isn't complicated, it's basic risk management. And basic risk management is driving the quietest financial revolution in modern history. Let me show you the evidence that this revolution is already reshaping global finance. Look at the gold markets. Central banks have been buying gold at record rates for the past 5 years. In 2022 alone, central banks purchased over 1,100 tons of gold, the highest level of buying in 50 years. Why gold? Because gold isn't anyone's liability. It's not issued by any government. It can't be printed. It can't be frozen. It can't be sanctioned. In a world where financial assets are increasingly vulnerable to political manipulation, gold represents the ultimate hedge against systemic risk. And the fact that central banks are buying it at record rates tells you everything you need to know about their confidence in the current financial system. They're not abandoning the dollar, they're hedging against its decline. Building insurance policies against a future where dollar assets may no longer provide the safety they once did. This isn't speculation, it's preparation. And preparation is the rational response to a system showing signs of strain. But let me be perfectly clear about something else. The shift away from the dollar isn't happening because America lacks the power to maintain its dominance. America has more than enough power to maintain dollar hegemony for decades to come. The problem isn't capability, it's credibility. Credibility is the currency of global finance, and America is spending that currency faster than it's earning it, through sanctions that alienate allies, through deficits that undermine confidence, through political dysfunction that threatens stability. Each action spends credibility, and credibility, once spent, is hard to regain. This isn't about America being weak. It's about America making choices that undermine the very credibility required to maintain dollar dominance. Choices that prioritize short-term political gain over long-term financial stability. Choices that sacrifice global confidence for domestic convenience. And the bill for those choices is coming due. Not in collapse, but in quiet, relentless diversification away from dollar dependency. A diversification that is already underway, already accelerating, already reshaping the global financial landscape in ways that will affect every person watching this video. Now let me show you exactly what this diversification means for your financial future. When the dollar loses its privileged position, several things happen. First, borrowing costs rise. America can no longer borrow cheaply in its own currency. Interest rates increase. Deficits become more expensive to finance. Second, inflation becomes harder to control. Without global demand for dollars, the value of the currency falls. Imports become more expensive. Prices rise. Third, geopolitical influence declines. Sanctions lose their bite when nations have alternatives. Alliances weaken when economic interdependence frays. Fourth, financial markets become more volatile. Without the dollar as a stable anchor, global capital flows become more unpredictable. Risk premiums rise, uncertainty increases. None of these outcomes are inevitable, but all of them become more likely as dollar dominance erodes. And the erosion is already underway. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but steadily, relentlessly, like water dripping on stone. Each day, each transaction, each decision to use an alternative to the dollar represents another small step away from the system that has defined American prosperity for generations. And while you were distracted by headlines about inflation and interest rates, this quiet transformation has been accelerating beneath the surface of daily life. But here's the uncomfortable truth I need you to hear. This transformation isn't happening to America. It's happening because of America. Because of choices made in Washington. Because of policies pursued without regard for their long-term consequences. Because of a failure to recognize that global financial leadership requires more than military power or economic size. It requires trust. It requires credibility. It requires the willingness to put global stability ahead of short-term political gain. And America has been failing that test for years. Not because its leaders are incompetent, but because the incentives of domestic politics often conflict with the requirements of global leadership. When you have to win an election every 2 years, long-term thinking becomes a luxury you can't afford. When your political opponents attack any compromise as weakness, cooperation becomes impossible. When your base demands protectionism, free trade becomes politically toxic. These aren't excuses, they're explanations. And explanations matter because they help us understand not just what's happening, but why it's happening, and why it's likely to continue happening unless something fundamental changes. Let me show you exactly how these domestic political dynamics are undermining dollar dominance. Take the debt ceiling. Every few years, Congress engages in a high-stakes game of chicken over raising the debt limit. The stakes? Nothing less than the full faith and credit of the United States. The message to global markets: America's political system is so dysfunctional that it might default on its obligations, not because it can't pay, but because it won't. This isn't just irresponsible, it's suicidal. Every debt ceiling standoff erodes confidence in American institutions. Every threat of default encourages creditors to diversify away from dollar assets. Every moment of uncertainty accelerates the shift toward alternatives. And yet, we keep doing it. Why? Because the short-term political gains outweigh the long-term economic costs. Because the people who benefit from brinkmanship aren't the same people who pay the price for eroded confidence. This isn't conspiracy, it's misaligned incentives. And misaligned incentives are destroying the very foundations of dollar dominance. But let me be perfectly clear about something. I'm not saying America is doomed. I'm not saying the dollar will collapse next week, or next year, or even next decade. What I'm saying is that the trajectory has changed. The direction has shifted. The momentum has turned. And momentum matters more than current position in global finance. You can be at the top of the mountain and still be sliding downhill. You can have the largest economy in the world and still be losing ground to alternatives. You can maintain dollar dominance for years to come and still be on a path toward gradual erosion of that dominance. This isn't about collapse. It's about evolution. And evolution is already underway. Not because other nations are conspiring against America, but because rational actors respond to incentives. And the incentives are increasingly pointing away from dollar dependency toward regional alternatives, local currencies, and non-dollar payment systems. This isn't malice, it's mathematics. And mathematics doesn't care about your feelings or your politics or your nostalgia for a unipolar world that no longer exists. Let me show you exactly how this mathematics is playing out in real time. Look at the numbers. In 2000, the dollar accounted for over 70% of global foreign exchange reserves. Today, that number is closer to 60%. In 2000, over 80% of global trade was invoiced in dollars. Today, that number is under 70%. In 2000, SWIFT processed over 90% of international payment messages. Today, alternative systems like China's CIPS and Russia's SPFS are gaining market share. These trends aren't dramatic, they're gradual. But gradual trends compound over time. A 1% shift per year becomes 10% over a decade, 20% over 2 decades, 30% over 3 decades. And 30% erosion of dollar dominance would fundamentally reshape the global financial landscape. It would end the exorbitant privilege that has allowed America to borrow cheaply and spend lavishly for generations. It would force fiscal discipline on a political system that has forgotten what discipline looks like. It would redistribute global power from Washington to Beijing, Brussels, New Delhi, and other emerging centers of influence. This isn't speculation, it's arithmetic. And arithmetic is unforgiving. But here's what almost nobody is talking about. The shift away from the dollar isn't just an economic phenomenon. It's a generational phenomenon. The leaders who built the Bretton Woods system, Harry Truman, John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, they understood what was at stake. They had lived through the Great Depression. They had seen the consequences of competitive devaluations and trade wars. They knew that global stability required American leadership. And they were willing to pay the price for that leadership, even when it meant constraining American power for the sake of global order. But that generation is gone. Their successors, the baby boomers who came of age during the Cold War, grew up believing in American exceptionalism. They believed that America's power was permanent, that the dollar's dominance was guaranteed, that the world would always need American leadership, and they governed accordingly. But now a new generation is emerging, millennials and Gen Z leaders who didn't experience the Cold War, who didn't live through the Great Depression, who see American power not as permanent, but as provisional, who understand that multipolarity isn't a threat to be resisted, but a reality to be managed. This generational shift matters because it changes the assumptions underlying global finance. The old generation assumed dollar dominance was permanent. The new generation knows it's conditional. And that knowledge is driving the quietest financial revolution in modern history. Let me show you exactly how this generational shift is manifesting in policy. Look at the attitudes toward sanctions. The baby boomer generation saw sanctions as a powerful tool of American statecraft, a way to punish adversaries without going to war. But the millennial generation sees sanctions differently. They see them as blunt instruments that often hurt ordinary people more than regimes. They see them as counterproductive, driving nations toward alternatives rather than compliance. They see them as unsustainable in a multipolar world where other powers can offer lifelines to sanctioned states. This isn't idealism, it's realism. And realism is gaining ground in foreign policy circles around the world. Not because idealists are winning arguments, but because realists are recognizing that the old tools no longer work in a new world. When you sanction Russia and drive it closer to China, you haven't weakened Russia. You've strengthened the Russia-China axis. When you sanction Iran and push it toward Russia and China, you haven't isolated Iran. You've integrated it into an anti-American bloc. When you threaten secondary sanctions against European companies doing business with Iran, you haven't strengthened transatlantic unity. You've driven Europe to build alternatives to American financial infrastructure. This isn't conspiracy, it's blowback. And blowback is accelerating the shift away from dollar dominance. But let me be perfectly clear about something else. The shift away from the dollar isn't happening because America lacks the tools to maintain its dominance. America has every tool it needs to preserve dollar hegemony for decades to come. The problem isn't tools, it's strategy. Strategy requires understanding not just what you want, but what the world needs. Not just what you can do, but what others will accept. Not just what serves your short-term interests, but what sustains your long-term position. And America has been failing that strategic test for years. Not because its leaders are stupid, but because they're trapped in a mindset that no longer reflects reality. A mindset that assumes unipolarity when the world is becoming multipolar. A mindset that assumes dollar dominance when alternatives are emerging. A mindset that assumes American exceptionalism when other nations are pursuing their own exceptionalism. This isn't about America being weak. It's about America being blind. Blind to the changes happening around it. Blind to the alternatives being built without its participation. Blind to the quiet revolution that is already reshaping the global financial landscape. Let me show you exactly how this blindness is manifesting in policy. Take the approach to China. For decades, American strategy assumed that China would eventually liberalize, that economic integration would lead to political opening. That assumption guided everything from WTO accession to trade policy to investment rules. But that assumption was wrong. China didn't liberalize. It doubled down on authoritarianism. It built alternative institutions. It created parallel systems. And now those systems are challenging American dominance in ways that were unimaginable 20 years ago. Not through military confrontation, but through financial innovation, through payment systems, through currency internationalization, through digital infrastructure. China isn't trying to replace America, it's trying to create options. Options for itself, options for its partners, options for anyone who wants an alternative to American financial hegemony. And those options are gaining traction, not because they're better, but because they're different. Because they offer sovereignty where America offers dependency. Because they provide choice where America provides ultimatums. This isn't about China being stronger. It's about America being less attractive. And attractiveness matters more than strength in global finance. But here's the uncomfortable truth I need you to hear. America's declining attractiveness isn't just about China. It's about America. About the choices America has made that have made it less attractive as a partner, less reliable as an ally, less trustworthy as a financial anchor. Choices like weaponizing the dollar through sanctions. Choices like running perpetual deficits without consequence. Choices like allowing political dysfunction to threaten the full faith and credit of the United States. Each choice makes America less attractive. Each action erodes trust. Each decision accelerates the shift toward alternatives. This isn't about America being weak. It's about America making itself weaker through its own actions. Through policies that prioritize short-term political gain over long-term financial stability. Through decisions that sacrifice global confidence for domestic convenience. And the bill for those choices is coming due. Not in collapse, but in quiet, relentless diversification away from dollar dependency. A diversification that is already underway. Already accelerating, already reshaping the global financial landscape in ways that will affect every person watching this video. Let me show you exactly what this diversification means for the average American. When the dollar loses its privileged position, your cost of living goes up. Not because of inflation in the traditional sense, but because imports become more expensive. Oil, electronics, clothing, medicine. Everything you buy that comes from overseas costs more when the dollar weakens. And the dollar will weaken as global demand for it declines. Not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, relentlessly, like water dripping on stone. Each percentage point decline in dollar reserves represents another small increase in the cost of imported goods. Each transaction settled in an alternative currency represents another small reduction in dollar demand. Each nation that diversifies away from dollar assets represents another small erosion of the foundations that have kept American living standards artificially high for decades. This isn't punishment, it's arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care about your politics or your feelings or your nostalgia for a world that no longer exists. But let me be perfectly clear about something. This isn't inevitable. America still has time to change course, to rebuild trust, to restore credibility, to demonstrate the fiscal discipline and political stability required to anchor the global monetary system for another generation. But changing course requires recognizing that you're on the wrong path. And that recognition requires honesty. Honesty about the choices that have undermined dollar dominance. Honesty about the policies that have alienated allies and driven nations toward alternatives. Honesty about the political dysfunction that threatens America's ability to lead. Without that honesty, nothing changes. The trajectory continues. The momentum builds. The alternatives gain traction. And America wakes up one day to find that the world has moved on without it. Not because America collapsed, but because America chose short-term political gain over long-term financial stability, chose domestic convenience over global leadership, chose dysfunction over discipline. This isn't prophecy, it's pattern recognition. And the pattern is clear for anyone willing to see it. Let me show you exactly what needs to change. First, America needs to stop weaponizing the dollar. Sanctions have their place in foreign policy, but when every disagreement becomes a reason to freeze assets or cut off financial access, you create powerful incentives for alternatives. Nations that once had no choice but to accept dollar dominance now have reasons to build systems that bypass American control. And they're doing exactly that. Second, America needs to demonstrate fiscal discipline. Running trillion-dollar deficits year after year without consequence erodes confidence in the dollar's long-term value. Foreign holders see this happening. They feel the erosion of their wealth, and they respond by diversifying away from dollar assets. Third, America needs to restore political stability. Debt ceiling standoffs that threaten default every few years signal to the world that American institutions are unreliable, that the full faith and credit of the United States is subject to partisan brinkmanship. That's not leadership, that's dysfunction, and dysfunction destroys the trust required to maintain dollar dominance. These changes aren't easy. They require political courage. They require long-term thinking. They require putting global stability ahead of short-term political gain. But without these changes, the trajectory continues. The momentum builds, the alternatives gain traction, and America's privileged position erodes. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. But here's the uncomfortable truth I need you to hear. Even if America makes all these changes, the shift away from the dollar will continue. Not because America is weak, but because the world is evolving. Because multipolarity is replacing unipolarity. Because nations that once had no choice but to accept dollar dominance now have alternatives. And alternatives change everything. When you have only one option, you accept it, even if it's flawed. When you have multiple options, you choose the one that serves your interests best. That's not disloyalty, that's rationality. And rationality is driving the quietest financial revolution in modern history. America can slow this revolution. It can manage the transition. It can preserve elements of dollar dominance for decades to come, but it cannot stop the fundamental shift toward a more multipolar, more fragmented global financial system. That ship has sailed. The question isn't whether the world is moving away from the dollar. The question is how America will navigate that transition. Will it lead the change, or will it be dragged along by forces it no longer controls? That's the real question. And the answer will determine not just America's financial future, but its place in the world for generations to come. So let me leave you with this thought. The world is moving away from the dollar, not because America is weak, but because the world is changing, because alternatives are emerging, because rational actors are responding to incentives. This isn't malice, it's mathematics. And mathematics doesn't care about your feelings or your politics, or your nostalgia for a unipolar world that no longer exists. The question for you, for every American watching this video, is whether you recognize what's happening. Whether you understand the forces reshaping the global financial landscape. Whether you're prepared for a world where the dollar no longer provides the privileges it once did. Because that world is coming. Not tomorrow, not next year, but sooner than most people think. And when it arrives, those who understand the shift will be better positioned to navigate it. Those who recognize the patterns will be better prepared for the changes. Those who see the reality clearly will be better equipped to adapt. This isn't fear-mongering, it's awareness. And awareness is the first step toward agency. The dollar isn't dying, it's becoming optional. And optional is the beginning of the end. What do you think? Is America prepared for a world where the dollar is no longer dominant? Or are we sleepwalking into a future we never saw coming? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to understand how these quiet shifts will reshape your financial future, subscribe now. Because the world is changing, and awareness is the first step toward agency.